Shalom Aleichem. We are exploring Likkutei Sichas, volume 24, Vayera, the Rashi Sicha, and this is, of course, the beginning of the parsha, where Hashem reveals himself to Avraham Avinu, and Avraham Avinu is sitting outside his tent. Avraham is being visited by Hashem to bring refuah after the bris milah. And then the language is that he lifted up his eyes and he saw the three men coming towards him. And he ran towards them and he bowed. And then the next verse is on the screen, and he said, I'm going to use the term Adnai. I don't want to pronounce it correctly because then I could be saying Hashem's name in vain. Adnai. If I have found favor in your eyes, please do not depart from your servant. Let's get some water, wash your feet, and rest under the tree. And then he goes on and on how he's going to host them and give them food, etc., etc., etc. And the discussion in Rashi is, who is he talking to in this verse 3? And Rashi gives two interpretations. The first one is that he's actually talking to the people. The verse says he sees three people, and he runs towards them and he bows, and then he says, Adni, not a reference to God, actually a reference to them, referring to them as master, with respect. Please don't leave. I want you to stay for lunch. And then Rashi is very long and wordy. He was speaking, I'm reading the first approach. He's speaking to the greatest one while calling them all masters, but addressing the greatest, assuming they'll stay if he stays. Adnai thus is not sacred. Adnai, of course, can sometimes be sacred. It can be God's name, which is usually how it is. But this is going to be one of the exceptions, or maybe the only exception, to the rule that Adnai doesn't mean God, it means master. He's speaking to them. And then Rashi gives a second approach that actually Adnai is sacred, like it normally is. It's Hashem's name. He says God. And he's telling God, wait while I go and host the guests. Those are the two interpretations Rashi brings, and both approaches are from the Medrash. That's how Rashi concludes. And the Rebbe asks questions. First of all, why two interpretations? We know the principle of Rashi is that he's here for the literal pshat of the verse. So give me one interpretation. Give me the one that's most pshat-like. When Rashi gives two, that means there's something wrong with one or the other. And one is not sufficient. Why do you need two? Come up with one interpretation. And in fact, the logical interpretation would be the second one, which is he's talking to God. And why? Because throughout the whole Torah, whenever it says those four letters, Adnai, it means God. This is an exception. I don't know if it's the only exception, but it's close to it. Adnai always means God, or generally means God. So therefore, we'll just have the second interpretation, have only one interpretation, and call it a day. Why need two? And then why, the question B, which already touched upon it, why in this order? Meaning if there's two answers, the first answer is the one that's much more logical, that's much closer to pshat, to the literal interpretation. Really? Adnai everywhere means God. And that's approach number two. That should be approach one. And if that doesn't suffice, you add a second approach that it really, in this case, it's an exception and it doesn't mean God, it means people. But no, Rashi chooses as his first approach, which means the answer that he finds much closer to the literal pshat. That it's not referring to God as it normally is. No, this is an exception. Why? And then the Rebbe has some more diukim, some more nuances that he looks at. Question C. I underlined it in the box. That in question one, in approach one, he concludes his remarks by saying that Adnai here is Loshin Choil, not sacred. That's the use of this term. Whereas in the second approach, he begins with that. It's Loshin Kodesh, it's sacred. That's a way of saying that certain words that can be a reference to God's name or a reference to mankind. Parenthetically, sometimes the word Elokim can be Loshin Kodesh. a language of holiness, referring to God, and it can be lashon chol, a mundane usage. Elokim could mean judges. Elokim could something mean strong men or angels. So this is not the only word that can go either way. Lashon shel kodesh, a holy application, or lashon shel chol, a mundane or non-sacred application. But what Rebbe finds curious is, why does Rashi make that point? But in the approach 1, he finishes with it, and in approach 2, he begins with it. It's not symmetrical. Either begin with it because that's your introduction, or end with it as a footnote. It stands out, this difference. It stands out. Question D. Let's understand the first approach. Just the whole flow of it is strange. Avram, is speaking to the greatest one while he's calling them all masters, but addressing the greatest, assuming they'll all stay. So he keeps going yin-ing and yanging back and forth. Wait a minute, he's speaking to one, but he's addressing the whole lot of them, but he's really talking to one. It's sort of like he's dividing the verse, let's look at the verse over here on top. He's saying, Adnai, my master, referring to all of them, because Adnai is plural. And then the rest of the verse, he's talking to one guy. If I found favor in your eyes, do not depart. Why does Rashi do that? Why does Rashi do that? Why doesn't he just say that he's talking to one person? Why does he flip-flop and sort of divide the verse in a complicated way that he is really addressing them all with the title master, but the conversation is directed at one of them, who will then impress upon the others to follow his example if he decides to stay. Like, be consistent. And if you read the verse is in singular. If I found favors in your eyes, do not depart from your servant. It's singular. Al no sa'avor, not plural, I'm not ta'avoru. So clearly he's talking to one. He's talking to one. But if he's talking to one, why does Rashi feel the need to decide that the introduction, Adnai, masters, is talking to all of them and referring to them all as masters? That's strange. That's splitting the verse. Why would you do that? Why would you address all as masters and then speak to one? If you're speaking to one, address the one. And if you're going to say Rashi is forced to say this because Adnai is plural, which is what other commentaries suggest, other commentaries on Rashi say, why does Rashi decide this split? That he's addressing all three with the title master, but then he's talking to one, which is very strange. They say, well, he has no choice because Adnai is plural and the rest of the verse is singular. Do not depart. Al not ta'avor, singular. So he's got to be talking to one person, but Adnai is plural, my masters. But the Rebbe says that with all respect to those commentaries on Rashi, in Rashi, it is not uncommon in Rashi level of Torah study. It's not uncommon that when you're talking to somebody with respect, someone who you're looking up to, a person of respect and honor and power and leadership, you address them in plural. And there's an explicit Rashi later in this Torah portion where Rashi gives numerous examples of that. One of them is that Joseph's master is referred to as Adonai Yosef, the masters of Joseph, even though it's one person. Because sometimes you speak about masters in plural, and Rashi gives numerous examples of how that's found. So clearly the Rebbe argues very strongly. This is an entire long Rashi later in this portion, which gives numerous examples that Rashi doesn't believe that Adnai pluralistically has a problem, is in conflict to the fact that he was speaking to one. He was speaking to the one, but he was speaking with respect. For those who know Yiddish, when you're speaking to a person of respect, you say ir. It's a little bit like you'll speak to a group. And therefore, Adnai can be plural and it's speaking to one, and then you don't have to split the verse. So back to question number D. Why would you address one, but convey the title master on the many? And the answer that Adnai is plural and the rest of the verse is singular is not a problem. in Rashi level study, says the Rebbe, proving it from a Rashi later on in this very portion. So that's a very strong question. Why does Rashi split that? And finally, E. Why does Rashi quote the Medrash at the end? This is a very loaded question. This E is really 4 questions in and of itself. First of all, Rashi most often, does not quote a source. Every Rashi has a source, for the most part, in the oral Torah, either in Gemara or in Medrash, or what have you. But for the most part, Rashi doesn't quote a source because he wants to keep it simple. And if he does quote a source, it's because it's needed to help explain something between the lines to the student who's going to look deeper. So why does he need a source to begin with? And secondly, if he brings a source, he will usually begin with it. He'll introduce it. If Rashi decides for whatever reason that he has to say that this is a midrashic thing, he'll open with it. Our sages taught us in the Medrash. Our sages have taught, and that's how we'll open. It's seldom and rare that he finishes with it almost as a sign-off. Like, why? It's curious. And then finally, why does he quote the Medrash and not the Gemara, the Talmud? These 2 approaches are brought in the Gemara. In the Medrash, according to the version that we have, it only has one of the interpretations. Doesn't even have both. So it must be that Rashi had a more less well-known version of the Medrash, which had both, because the popular version only has one. So for many reasons, if Rashi does want to cite a source, he should quote the Talmud. First of all, the Talmud is actually a much closer to Pshat level of study than Medrash is. So it's much more appropriate for a Rashi entry to be Talmud-oriented than Medrash-oriented. And secondarily, in the popular Medrash, you don't even have these 2 interpretations. So question E is a loaded one. Why even give a source? If you're giving one, why put it at the end? And why Medrash and not Talmud? When Talmud is much closer to Rashi level study, plus in our version of Medrash, you don't even have both answers. So Rashi stretches it and chooses to put Medrash, even though he then has to rely on some less well-known version of the Medrash. So clearly Rashi's doing it to make a point. So this is a loaded Rashi with very strong questions. So to step back for a moment, the main concept is, why do we need 2 answers? Which indicates that one is better than the other, and you need both. Neither one is completely satisfactory. Why? Again, on the face of it, we could just say, Adonai means God. He was talking to God, told God to wait. And if you're going to choose 2, shouldn't the second one be number 1? Because that's much more in line with the general usage of the word. And also this whole business with Adonai referring to all of the angels and the message addressing only one. What's the need? So the Rebbe comes along and says, let's take a look. Let's take a look at the 2 approaches. Let's take a look at the 2 approaches and let's analyze the plus and minus in both. So the advantage of approach 1, says the Rebbe, this to me is one of the biggest ahas of this Sicha. Why is approach 1 so important? And why is it really better? Because now most of the commentaries, it seems, believe that approach 1 was needed because there's a problem with the plural versus singular. That's what seems to be the problem in the verse. Adonai, my masters, if I found favor in your eyes, singular, don't move on. How can you switch from plural to singular? It's a problem. Unless you're speaking to God, then Adonai means God. But if you're speaking to people, decide. But Rashi already told us, as I said earlier, that this plural singular is not in conflict in the pshat level. You sometimes speak to one person, but if you're speaking to them as a master, you address them as plural. So that's not what was bothering Rashi. To me, this is the biggest aha. I think most people who study this Rashi, myself included, before learning the Sicha, you think that's what bothering Rashi, the plural singular, and you're struggling with it. No, it's not. The problem is something else. The problem why you don't just read that this verse is a reference to God because it says God's name, Adonai, which generally means God. The problem is it doesn't flow with the next verse. The next verse is, take some water and wash your feet and rest under the tree, and I'm going to make you food. That's clearly can't be talking to God. So that's the advantage of this approach. Now, the advantage of the second approach that he's referring to Hashem is because Adonai generally means Hashem. So you might say that if you are focusing on the language, on the text, on the words, on the verbiage, the second approach is closer to Pshat. But if you're focusing on context, the first approach is much closer to Pshat. Because otherwise, if he's talking to God in verse 3, suddenly in verse 4, he's talking about water and bread and trees. So, and the Rebbe will say this, parenthetically, the Rebbe will say this in many Sichas, that when there's two answers, and we assume that the first one is closer to the Pshat's literal level, and the second is further, it's often because one makes more sense in context, and one makes more sense in language, in strict language. And context trumps language. Both are part of Pshat. But if you have to have an edge, context means that's the Pshat, that's what we're talking about. But then there's also the language. And we like that also to fit. So that would be the advantage of each one of these interpretations. And that's why interpretation one, approach one becomes first, because it flows better. But approach two has an edge because it goes by, in terms of the word Adonai, if you're looking at the verbiage, Adonai means generally God. So that's the advantage and disadvantage of each. So now let's look at the difficulties of each. So first of all, the difficulty that we just said. Approach one, the word Adonai is being taken out of its normal meaning. Approach two, that the verses simply don't flow. Okay. But then there are more problems. In verse 1, in approach 1, we have a problem. Why are we speaking in singular? And why not address all three? The Rebbe is, again, not bothered by the fact that the word Adonai means masters, because that's okay. That's a matter of respect. It's a matter of respect. But if we're speaking in singular, that means you have to assume, if he's speaking to the guest, that he spoke to one of them. He addressed the senior one, the greatest one, and he's assuming the others are going to follow suit. Why would you do that? It's not nice. It's not the nicest thing to do when you're standing with three people to address one. And even though you're going to say, well, he addressed one and the others are going to follow suit, but they're going to feel bad. So it's for this reason that Rashi splits it. And Rashi says that even though he's addressing one, because he assumes that the others are going to follow, and therefore he's breaking protocol. He's not behaving in the nicest way, because he's talking to one person while two others are standing by and just watching. Not the sweetest thing to do. Aha! But because he addressed them all as masters, that's why Rashi says Adonai is referring to all of them, not because he's bothered by the pluralistic language, but because he's bothered by the lack of nimus. The word nimus that Rabbi uses, the lack of human menschlichkeit, that he's addressing one person in the presence of all three. But if you tell me that he first addressed them all, he said, Adonai, masters, ha, hello. And then he turned to one of them, after he said to them all hello, and noch with the title of covered masters. Then he turns to one of them and he says, I think you guys should stay. I think you should stay. Assuming that he's in charge, and whatever he does, the others are going to follow suit. So it makes sense why Rashi's doing that. We just answer why Rashi's flip-flopping and going from singular to plural. He spoke to one, then he addressed them all, because he's trying to explain the menschlichkeit of the moment, but the question still remains problematic. In the end of the day, why address one if you can address them all? For the same price, you're talking to one, talk to all. It'll be nicer, it'll be sweeter, but more inclusive. These are problems, but they're not huge problems. If you look at approach two, it's got bigger problems. Why would you leave Hashem and go take care of the guests? This doesn't make any sense on the literal level. Now, every child has been taught what the Gemara says, that from here we learn that inviting guests is greater than inviting the Shekhinah, and he told the Hashem to wait, and he took care of the guests. But this is from the Gemara. Rashi does not bring that. Rashi does not bring that statement. that Hachnasas Orchim, inviting guests, is greater than receiving the Shechina, because on the Pshat level, it's not true. It's true on the Gemara level. It's true on a very lofty level. On Pshat, on literal level of study, you let Hashem wait so you can go take care of guests? Rashi does not mention that Chazal, that teaching of our sages. And therefore, on the Rashi level, approach 2 has a massive problem. He's talking to Hashem, and he's standing at the gate of his tent, and Hashem came to him at the heat of the day, and he sees 3 people, and he says, Hashem, please don't leave. I got to go take care of the guests. Big problem. Plus, the Rebbe says, adds parenthetically there, that Hashem likely already left. And here's the Rebbe's argument. You see, when the Hashem came for a reason, what's the reason? To visit the sick. Abraham was sick. The angels came, one of the angels came with the purpose of healing him. And for an angel, it doesn't take any time to accomplish his mission. The minute he comes, Abraham is healed. Abraham is healed. There's no need for Hashem to visit him because he's not sick. So the Rebbe wants to argue that on a pshat level, as we see later in Rashi himself, that the angels did their mission quickly and then they departed. So if the angel cured Abraham, he didn't leave yet because he had to save Lot, but he cured Abraham because the same angel then had a new job. But the minute Abraham is cured, because presumably the moment they arrive, Abraham is cured, so Hashem can leave. Why would Hashem hang around? The whole purpose of the visit was to cure Abraham. So there's no need for Hashem to be there. So on the Rashi, on the Pshat level, the story has to be Hashem appeared to him, visited him. He saw 3 angels coming. He was cured. Hashem left. And then he greeted the angels. So the approach 2 has a lot of serious problems. Approach 1 is not perfect. Primarily because the word Adonai is being used in a non-conventional way. It's not a big problem though, but it's not perfect. Plus, we're bothered by the fact that he didn't address all 3. And you have to come up with a creative thing that he did. He gave them all this hello, Adonai, master, and then he addressed one. So he wasn't really not a mensch, but he's not really a super mensch. It's a little strange. So these are problems, but they're not problems. Approach 2 has huge problems. The verses don't flow at all. If he's talking to Hashem, why would he continue the conversation without stopping to take a breath? To say, let's take water and bread and sit under the tree and have a picnic? That doesn't flow. Number 2, it doesn't make sense on a pshat level to leave Hashem and take care of guests. Besides, Hashem probably already left. Therefore, it makes sense that Rashi prefers approach 1, but he brings also approach 2 because it's not good enough. So based on this, we answer all our questions. Let's come back here. Why 2 interpretations? We already know there's problems with each. Why is interpretation number 1 first? Because it has a lot less problems, as we discussed. A lot less problems. Why question C? In the first approach, he finishes that Adonai is not sacred. And in question 2, he begins that Adonai is sacred. It's because how important is that definition, whether Adonai is being used here in a sacred usage or non-sacred usage? In approach 1, it's not very important. It's a footnote. The reason why Rashi is making this choice nothing to do with sacred or not. It has to do with the fact that Rashi decides that he's addressing the people because of the flow of the verses, etc. And he says, and by the way, so you now know that it's not sacred. So he just explains that don't get concerned that we're using that word. It's a non-sacred usage of it. But in the second interpretation, that's the main foundation. The advantage, perhaps the only advantage of the second interpretation, the only real advantage is that you're using the name in its sacred form, which is most generally used. And therefore Rashi begins with it. Very strong point. D, addressed 1 while calling them all masters. So we said, yeah, that's a little strange. But nevertheless, Rashi is saying it because Rashi wants to explain that he's not being not a mensch. Even though he's addressing 1 and expecting the others to follow that one's lead, but at least he gave them all a Shalom Aleichem. He gave them all masters. Hello. So it's important because otherwise it wouldn't reflect well on Abraham. It wouldn't make sense. It wouldn't fit his character. And finally, Why quote the Medrash at the end? And why quote the Medrash at all? So the Rebbe says because both of these answers are not totally satisfactory. Both of these answers don't flow purely in the pshat level. That's the word that Rebbe uses. It's not pure pshat. Both of them have real issues. And therefore, at the end of the day, after we study one, then we study the other, we realize that we're carrying around baggage here that makes them not really pshat comfortable. And therefore, they're midrashic. And therefore, even though, so Rashi feels the need to say it's midrashic, and even though it's found in the Talmud, and in the Medrash, not every Medrash has both. You have to find an obscure version to find both. It doesn't matter. Rashi is going to find that version because he wants you to know that this Rashi is saying that this verse has to be understood based on a midrashic approach. Like some other Rashis, where Rashi says, I'm going to give you a Medrash because it's the only way to understand this verse. It's a Medrash that will work with Pshat. It's okay, but it's not pure Pshat. This verse is not to be understood pure Pshat. And that's why he puts it at the end, because we come to that conclusion once we study the Rashi. Once we study approach 1 and we study approach 2, we understand the problems of each. We say, yeah, this is a midrashic thing. And clearly, one might say that the verse was written in an obscure way to begin with. It's using a term which is normally God. And here it might refer to people, and it's referring plural to singular. And it goes right into the discussion of the water and the thing. Perhaps I'm suggesting that Hashem wrote it that way to force this midrashic approach, which basically says, yeah, it means both. It means he's speaking to the people, because that's the flow of the verses. But it's also hinting to the fact that he was speaking to Hashem, which teaches us so many things about Achnas HaSarchim and etc., etc.